organized the Concord Festival of Authors, and over the 22 years the festival has hosted numerous high-profile writers, several Pulitzer Prize winners, of course. Sandra Day O'Connor and former Governor Bill Weld each spoke here. Anita Hill spoke here a few years ago, and back in 1995 we hosted a young Harvard law grad named Barack Obama. At the time, of course, he was a totally unknown 33-year-old with an interesting life story and family history. But none of those people generated a response comparable to Noam Chomsky. I've received more phone calls and emails about Noam Chomsky, probably from half of you in the audience, than all of those other people put together. And the phone calls almost always start out asking incredulously, "The Noam Chomsky?" As though there's another Noam Chomsky. I have to say, I cannot take credit for inviting Noam Chomsky to speak. That credit goes to Marilyn Mudry of the Hawthorne Inn. It was sometime last spring that Marilyn emailed me that Noam Chomsky and his wife had stayed at the inn, and she had talked up the festival. And she said he might be interested in speaking here, and would I be interested in having him speak? So I emailed back to her, "The Noam Chomsky?" I'd like to thank the Fenn School for hosting us. Also thank our sponsors, Gatehouse Media, the Middlesex Savings Bank and Cambridge Trust Company, and of course the Massachusetts Cultural Council. I want to remind you that we have books by our guest speaker, which are available for you to purchase in the back, and he will sign books down here at the conclusion of the program. A lot of people bought books before the program started, so there are just a few left, actually. And proceeds from the sale of books go to the Friends of the Concord Library. The books that are available tonight are truly just a small fraction of Noam Chomsky's work. He, as you all know, is a prolific writer and has had a very long career. He's written literally hundreds of books and articles. It's not easy for a reader to keep up with Noam Chomsky. Somebody once said they stopped reading Noam Chomsky when they realized that Chomsky wrote faster than they could read. So Marilyn will do the honors of introducing our speaker. Marilyn Mudry and her husband Gregory Birch are innkeepers, as I said, for 38 years. That's since 1976. They've owned and operated the Hawthorne Inn in Concord. And as innkeepers, they are truly welcoming ambassadors to our community. For 22 years, all 22 years of this festival, they have supported us. They've hosted countless writers at the inn, not to mention providing ideas and insight about future programs and speakers. Marilyn and Gregory are also a real estate team with Keller Williams Realty. Please welcome Marilyn Mudry.
Thank you, Rob, for this honor of presenting the Festival Forum's guest this evening, Noam Chomsky. Many of you have been introduced to Noam through the reading of his prodigious output of over 100 books and a multitude of articles and papers. These reveal his broad breadth of interest, knowledge, and expertise in such diverse fields as linguistics, the cognitive sciences, analytic philosophy, political commentary, and social criticism. A truly creative and challenging opus of thoughts and ideas. And some of you may have the honor of knowing Mr. Chomsky as a teacher or mentor in his many years as an educator. My husband Gregory Birch and I had the pleasure of getting to know him, not so much through his books, but through the sharing of a beautiful and magical page in his life. Noam and Valeria, his wife, honored us as we witness their marriage in the Thorough Room here in Concord at the Hawthorne Inn. The love and pure joy pouring forth from one to the other, eyes sparkling and hearts open wide, is a memory we shall cherish. I am grateful for his presence here today to share with us his latest book on Western terrorism. Please welcome Noam Chomsky.
Not often that one has the pleasure of being introduced by one of the two witnesses at my wedding several months ago. Valeria and I, independently and in more recent years together, have had a close relationship with Concord. And with Nathaniel Hawthorne in particular, Hawthorne has been a long interest of Valeria's work in his life, and she reintroduced me to him after many years of absence, and ever since I read him in childhood. And that was one of the reasons why we selected not only Concord, but the Hawthorne Inn as the place where we would be married, very privately, two witnesses, Greg and Marilyn. And on the way here, we stopped to pay our respects to Sophie and Nathaniel. I hope they listen to us. Well, I want to comment on, actually, Nathaniel Hawthorne is pretty much the hero of the tale I want to tell today, so it would be only appropriate for me to dedicate the talk to Valeria. I want to comment on events in Concord 160 years ago. Events that provide a quite revealing insight into the nature of what was called the new class of intellectuals. This is a class that began to take shape in the West in the latter part of the 19th century. Actually, the term intellectual in the modern sense was just introduced at about that time, at the time of the Dreyfus trials. The class has become, and it was described at the time as a new class of scientific intellectuals, managerial, ideological, others. Bakunin was the first one to use the term, I think. It became a social formation with quite a substantial impact on the policies of the modern nation states that were forming at the time, and crucially the ideologies that support them. Well, 160 years ago was the Civil War, of course a watershed in American history. Its consequences remain very much alive today. Those of you who looked at the electoral maps in the 2012 election, red and blue, were basically witnessing the Civil War almost identically. And we'll see the same presumably in a few days. It's often been noted that the United States never developed political parties with the relatively sharp class lines of the European democracies. The parties have always had a sectional character, reflecting the residue of that bitter and destructive conflict. The slogan in the late 19th century was, "You vote as you shoot." That determines your party affiliation. And it remains essentially true today, even with the shift of names of the Party of the Confederacy in the wake of the Civil Rights Revolution of the 1960s, which was pretty much the determinant of it. Less discussed is the impact of the war on the intellectual world. That's the topic I want to talk about this evening. So Annie Belden Concord was the pride of the American intellectual world. one of the major world centers of thought and reflection. There were lively discussions of the major issues of the day, both here and in Boston, closely linked community, about the crime of slavery, what to do about it, the right of secession, which was actually advocated by many of the Concord intellectuals, pacifism, violence, and other issues that were tearing the country apart at the time and soon led to this devastating war. Many of the leading intellectual figures in the Concord community welcomed the outbreak of the war, and not only or even primarily because of the disgraceful crimes of slavery and racism, which were of course not perceived then quite in contemporary terms. As you know, the Emancipation Proclamation freed no slaves who were under federal jurisdiction. It was basically an act of war, not of liberation. In the Atlantic, one of the main intellectual journals at the time, as today, in 1962, an article in the Atlantic assured Northern intellectuals that the Negro was adapted to the Southern climate, I'm quoting, and if freed, would remain where he was, rather than go into the northern states, which were desirous to perpetuate in its purity the Anglo-Saxon blood. It's worth remembering that at that time there was a very widespread, deeply held mythology about Anglo-Saxon origins. It was rampant at the time, had lingering consequences well beyond. Well, the former slaves did have a decade of relative freedom after the Civil War. That ended with a North-South compact that allowed the South to establish a reign that was in many ways worse than slavery. Black life was effectively criminalized, so that pretty soon the bulk of the black male population, many women too, became a kind of slave labor force in the hands of the state, the government. These policies made a fundamental contribution to the Industrial Revolution that was just taking off in the late 19th, early 20th century. A familiar case is the chain gangs in the agricultural areas, but that was the least of it. It was also mines, industry, the entire Industrial Revolution, which was quite significant in the South, with the major corporations, U.S. Steel and others involved. Now that continued pretty much until World War II. At that time, there was a need for what's called free labor in the war industry. And then come several decades of relative opportunity for the African American population. From the 1980s, the drug war, Reagan's drug war, with its deeply racist character, has been reconstructing the late 19th century system in very ugly ways that should be familiar. It's now 500 years since the first slaves were brought here to Massachusetts. And it's a pretty shocking fact that over these 500 years, there have been only a few decades when the large majority of African Americans have had reasonable opportunities that they might have a decent life for themselves and their children. Well, there's no need to tarry now on the enormous significance of this grim history, but again, I want to talk about something different. How the intellectuals of Concord and Boston reacted to the outbreak of the war. The most important of them, of course, was Ralph Waldo Emerson. At first, he hailed Southern secession because, quoting him, he said, it would undermine the civil machinery that has become the religion of the world, and it would open the way to adult individualism. It's the radical individualism that he espoused that was his ideal. A few days later, literally, after the fall of Fort Sumter, Emerson sharply reversed his position. he rejoiced, again quoting, in the whirlwind of patriotism that was magnetizing all discordant masses under its terrific unity. And soon he joined those eminent intellectuals from the Concord, Boston community who even welcomed the horrendous loss of life. Because, as Emerson put it, one whole generation might well consent to perish if by their fall political liberty and a clean and just life could be made sure to the generations that followed. It was at that time that he wrote his famous poem hailing the fallen war hero Robert Gould Shaw, a Harvard graduate from the cultivated classes of the aristocracy, as Emerson put it, who showed, quoting the poem, that he showed how near is God to man when duty whispers low, thou must, the youth replies, I can. In the Atlantic, Emerson hailed Lincoln as a great and virtuous sovereign who had been chosen by divine providence as an instrument of benefit so vast, as you can tell from the rhetoric I'm quoting. Emerson's journals are filled with praise for war as an instrument of vitality and energy, and his pre-war commitment to kind of radical individualism very quickly vanished as he exulted in the fact that war organizes and forces individuals and states to combine and act with larger views. Actually, Emerson was riding a wave of enthusiasm for war and death, sometimes driving it forward because of his eminence as an intellectual. Former pacifists evoked divine providence to justify their new enthusiasm for war, destruction, and death. Thoreau didn't write much. According to those who knew him in Concord, it was, I'm quoting, in a state of exaltation about the moral regeneration of the nation through war. Charles Eliot Norton welcomed the great suffering and the loss of life because he said it would teach the nation to forget charming sentimentalities and recognize that it is real blood, not red paint, that flows, and real life-warm blood must flow and flow in torrents as we gain not only the courage to be killed, but the harder courage to kill. Norton went on to denounce what he called the feeble sentimentalities of an age of philanthropists who were devoted to alleviating suffering instead of justifying suffering as they should. He was perhaps the first person ever to give a kind of Darwinian argument for war shortly after Origin of Species. He held that throughout the animal kingdom, progress comes from pain and loss of life, so we should celebrate war and mass destruction and suffering. Oliver Wendell Holmes Jr., the great jurist and one of the founders of American pragmatism, he wrote, quote him, "The faith is true and adorable, which leads a soldier to throw away his life in obedience to a blindly accepted duty, in a cause which he little understands, in a plan of campaign of which he has no notion, under tactics of which he does not see the use. That is the true and adorable faith." And the war, Holmes felt, along with many others, would shape a generation that thinks in practical and pragmatic terms, committed to achieve necessary tasks in efficient ways. Actually, there was one notable exception to the chauvinist consensus, Nathaniel Hawthorne. He wrote that he was horrified and depressed by the mounting horrors, and his spirit could find no rest. The Atlantic did agree to publish an article of his, but with an editorial rebuttal admonishing Hawthorne that the counsels of wise and good men are often coincident with the purposes of providence, and the present war promises to illustrate our remark. Hawthorne was literally a unique exception among the eminent intellectuals of Concord Boston as well. This record was replayed half a century later when Woodrow Wilson, who had won the 1916 election on the slogan, "Peace without victory," very quickly switched to a crusade for victory without peace. The progressive intellectual community, the heirs of the Concord Boston intellectuals, they immediately leaped on the bandwagon, adapting the pragmatic doctrines that had been espoused by Holmes in his adorable faith. The leading figure of American pragmatism, John Dewey, quoting him, condemned the pacifists who wasted rather than invested their potentialities when they turned so vigorously to opposing entrance into the war instead of working for attainable goals within the prevailing chauvinist consensus, which was pretty extreme, as those of you who know this history are aware. He urged, so extreme, for example, that the Boston Symphony couldn't play Beethoven or Bach because of hatred of all things German. Very quick from peace without victory to victory without peace. Triumph of propaganda. John Dewey urged pacifists to change their tune from the intrinsic immorality of the use of coercive force to the comparative inefficiency and stupidity of existing methods of using force. The only question which can be raised about the justification of force, Dewey wrote, is that of comparative efficiency and economy in its use. If that sounds familiar, it's because it is. I'll return in a moment to the current manifestations of this pragmatic doctrine, and by current I mean right now, this month. But it should first be noted that the enthusiasm of this kind for war was virtually uniform among the intellectual classes of the entire Western world. In England, France, Germany, everywhere, the most eminent intellectuals lined up enthusiastically, immediately, in the service of the war machine, proclaiming the justice of the state to which they gave their allegiance. The Emerson model has been followed almost uniformly since. There were, of course, a few exceptions, the occasional Nathaniel Hawthorne. In England, Bertrand Russell. In Germany, Karl Liebknecht and Rosa Luxemburg. In the United States, Eugene Debs. All of them, incidentally, in jail for raising questions about the nobility of the war in the Western democracies and in Germany. Some were less severely punished. So in the United States, the great political economist Thorstein Veblen was only dismissed from his government post, not imprisoned. And Randolph Bourne, who was almost the only intellectual descendant of Hawthorne among the progressive intellectuals of the day, he was dropped from the progressive New Republic and John Dewey's Dial. Though I should add that in later years, to his credit, Dewey did change his position in significant ways. He's one of the very few. The pattern that was set in Concord 160 years ago is remarkably uniform. And in fact, if we trace it back before the term intellectually was used in the late 1960s, we find it pretty uniform back to the earliest recorded history, classical Greece and the Bible. There's time to go into that. But with remarkable consistency, the new class of intellectuals that became a significant social formation in the late 19th century, with remarkable consistency, they have always lent their talents to service to the war machine, sometime with reservations. But if you think about these reservations, they actually reveal the depth of their commitment to state violence. My predecessor here, current President Obama, is a good example. He is praised by liberals for his opposition to the Iraq War, which was surely the worst crime of the new millennium, horrifying impact that's now tearing not only Iraq, but the entire region to shreds. Obama's opposition was based on a strictly pragmatic principle. It's not working. As he put it, it was a strategic blunder. That's the criticism for which he's praised. On very similar grounds, some Russian leaders, generals, opposed the invasion of Afghanistan because it was a strategic blunder. It wasn't going to work. And going back farther, some Nazi generals criticized Hitler's launching of a two-front war instead of knocking out England first. We do not laud them as great moral leaders, but interpretations typically, almost universally, shift as soon as we look at ourselves. In fact, this merits some reflection. Well, let me go fast forward to right now, to the lead front page article in the New York Times on October 15th, with the headline, "It's official, the United States is the world's leading terrorist state and proud of it." Of course, that was not the actual headline. It should have been, it wasn't. The actual headline was more anodyne. The headline read, "CIA study of covert aid fueled skepticism about helping Syrian rebels," which is not false, but it politely avoids the point. The story reports a recent CIA study reviewing U.S. covert operations in order to determine how well they worked and what were the factors that contributed to success or failure. A good, pragmatic approach with distinguished forebears going back to Holmes, Dewey, and others. The first paragraph of the article cites the three major examples of covert aid that are being examined to see on pragmatic grounds. They are Angola, Nicaragua, and Cuba. Each of these cases is a major terrorist operation conducted by Washington, and nothing is said about it, so let me add what was missing. Angola was invaded by South Africa, which according to Washington was defending itself from one of the world's more notorious terrorist groups, Nelson Mandela's African National Congress. Now, that was 1988. By then, the Reagan administration was virtually alone in the world in its support for the apartheid regime. Reagan even had to violate congressional sanctions, which were passed over his veto, in order to increase trade with his South African ally. Meanwhile, the United States joined South Africa in providing the crucial support for Jonas Savimbi's terrorist UNITA army in Angola. And in fact, Washington continued to do so even after Savimbi had been roundly defeated in a carefully monitored free election, and even after South Africa had withdrawn support from this monster whose lust for power had brought appalling misery to his people. And those are the words of the British ambassador to Angola at the time, Mark Golding. He was seconded by the CIA station chief in neighboring Kinshasa. He warned that it wasn't a good idea to support him because of the extent of Savimbi's crimes. He was terribly brutal. But the U.S. continued alone to support him, even after South Africa had stopped doing so. The consequences were horrendous. There was a UN inquiry a year later, in 1989. It estimated that South African depredations led to 1.5 million deaths and over $60 billion in damages in neighboring countries alone, let alone what was happening in South Africa. Cuban forces finally beat back the South African aggressors and compelled them also to withdraw from illegally occupied Namibia. It's essentially the end of the apartheid regime. The U.S. was finally left alone in the world to support the monster who had brought appalling misery to his people. South Africans are well aware of Cuba's role in the liberation of Africa and the ending of apartheid. As soon as Nelson Mandela was released from prison, and one of his first acts was to declare, I'll quote him, that during all my years in prison, Cuba was an inspiration and Fidel Castro a tower of strength. Cuban victories with black soldiers, incidentally, destroyed the myth of the invincibility of the white oppressor and inspired the fighting masses of South Africa, a turning point for the liberation of our continent and of my people from the scourge of apartheid. What other country can point to a record of greater selflessness than Cuba has displayed in its relations to Africa? The terrorist commander, Henry Kissinger, in contrast, was apoplectic over the insubordination of what he called the pipsqueak Castro, who should be smashed. We learned from recently released internal documents. And we may recall that Mandela remained on the U.S. terrorist list until a few years ago. As late as 2008, he still had to have special State Department dispensation in order to enter the United States. That's the first case of covert aid. The second is Cuba. Second case highlighted in the CIA study. So taking a look at Cuba, we find that after the failed Bay of Pigs invasion, John F. Kennedy launched a major murderous and destructive terrorist campaign called Operation Mongoose, with the goal of bringing the terrors of the earth to Cuba. And these are the words of Kennedy's close associate, historian Arthur Schlesinger, in his semi-official biography of Robert Kennedy, the president's brother. Robert Kennedy was assigned responsibility for the terrorist war as his highest priority. The terrorist war run by the Kennedy brothers was no small affair. It involved 400 Americans, 2,000 Cubans, a private navy of fast boats, a $50 million annual budget, run in part from a Miami CIA station, which was functioning in violation of the Neutrality Act and of the law banning CIA operations in the United States. And operations were serious. They included bombing of hotels and industrial installations, sinking fishing boats, poisoning of crops and livestock, contamination of sugar exports, actually sinking of boats and shelling of hotels with visiting Russians, which could have caused problems. Some of these operations were not specifically authorized by the CIA, but rather carried out by the terrorist forces based in Miami that the U.S. funded and supported. That's a distinction without a difference in the case of official enemies. The plans of Operation Mongoose were for its terrorist activities to culminate in an uprising in October 1962, a memorable month, October 1962. They were to lead to a U.S. invasion in that month. By now, it is recognized by scholarship, mainstream scholarship, that this was one of the reasons why Premier Khrushchev placed missiles in Cuba in October 1962. That initiated a crisis that came perilously close to a terminal nuclear war. Defense Secretary Robert McNamara later conceded that if he had been a Cuban leader, as he put it, I might have expected a U.S. invasion. Terrorist attacks against Cuba continued after the missile crisis for another 30 years. The cost to Cubans was, of course, severe. The voices of the victims are almost never heard in the United States. They've been reported in detail for the first time in a study by Canadian scholar Keith Blender, The Unknown War, published in 2010, and they're still unheard. About all that's remembered are the CIA efforts to assassinate Castro, repeated efforts. These are dismissed as childish shenanigans. The attacks on Cubans were anything but childish, and they're gone from history, official history. The cost of the terrorist war, long terrorist war, was amplified by a crushing embargo, which continues in defiance of the world. 2 days ago, the United Nations voted once again endorsing, quoting, the necessity of putting an end to the economic, commercial, financial blockade imposed by the United States on Cuba. The vote, as usual, was 188 to 2, the United States and Israel, 3 abstentions, Pacific Island dependencies. There is by now some opposition to the embargo in high places in the United States because it is no longer useful, Hillary Clinton. Again, good pragmatic grounds going straight back to 150 years ago. The third case, Nicaragua, doesn't require any mention. Reagan's terrorist war was condemned by the International Court of Justice, which ordered the United States to terminate what it called the unlawful use of force, term meaning international terrorism, and to pay substantial reparations. Washington responded by escalating the war and vetoing a 1986 UN Security Council resolution calling on all states, meaning the United States, to observe international law. Well, going back to the New York Times report 2 weeks ago, it does quote President Obama. He said that he had asked the CIA to carry out such inquiries in order to find cases of financing and supplying arms to an insurgency in a country that actually worked out well. And they couldn't come up with much. So he has some reluctance about continuing large-scale international terrorism. No other reaction is reported to the recognition of Washington's leading role in international terrorism over a 50-year period. This is only the tip of an iceberg. Another illustration will be commemorated, or more accurately, should be commemorated in a few weeks, November 16th. It'll be interesting to see what mention there is of it. November 16th will be the 25th anniversary of the assassination of 6 leading Latin American intellectuals, Jesuit priests, by a terrorist unit of the Salvadoran Army, the Atacadal Brigade. Had a long trail of murder, torture, atrocities behind it, armed and trained by the United States, and actually fresh from renewed training at the John F. Kennedy School of Special Warfare, Counterinsurgency at Fort Bragg. As soon as they returned from their training, on the orders of the Salvadoran High Command, the brigade broke into the Jesuit University in San Salvador to murder the priests. That was their assignment, and also to kill any witnesses. They killed the housekeeper and her daughter, who happened to be nearby, just to make sure that the events wouldn't be repeated. The U.S., of course, denied them at the time. This event culminated the terrorist wars, the U.S. terrorist wars in Central America in the 1980s, with horrifying effects. The effects are still on the front pages of the newspapers in the reports of so-called illegal immigrants who are fleeing in no small measure from the consequences of the carnage and are being deported to survive, if they can, in the ruins. So there happens to be a considerable Mayan community in this region going down the coast to Rhode Island. They are refugees from a virtually genocidal slaughter, strongly supported by Ronald Reagan. He was blocked by Congress from directly participating, so succeeded in organizing his terrorist network to carry it out for him. The U.S. is not like private terrorists, small retail terrorists. We're a state. Therefore, we use terrorist states to carry out our missions. In this case, primarily Israel, which provided the training and the arms for the killers, also Taiwan, some others, South Africa. And they're still fleeing, partly from the wreckage that was left, and deported to survive if they can. Actually, if you look carefully, most of the refugees coming, including the children who are on the front pages, are coming from Honduras. And there's a reason for that. In 2009, the president of Honduras, who had begun to undertake somewhat liberal steps, was ousted in a military coup. This was denounced through the hemisphere, not by the United States. And the United States, under Obama, was virtually alone in authorizing the fraudulent election, which took place under the military regime that permits U.S. military aid and other aid to continue to flow to what's called the elected government, in effect a military junta. This has led to a period of terrible atrocities in Honduras. It's the murder capital of the world, and people are fleeing and being deported if they can manage to reach the border. That's the immigrant story that we read about. Well, Washington has also emerged as the world champion in generating terror by others. The former CIA analyst Paul Pillar, leading commentary on the Middle East, warns of the impact of what he calls the resentment-generating impact of U.S. strikes in Syria, which may further induce the jihadi organizations, al-Nusra and ISIS, induce them towards repairing their breach from last year and campaigning in tandem against the U.S. intervention by portraying it as a war against Islam. That is now a familiar consequence of U.S. operations through this millennium, which have helped to spread jihadism from a small corner of Afghanistan to a very large part of the world. The most fearsome current manifestation is ISIS, the self-designated Islamic State. It's established its murderous caliphate in large areas of Iraq and Syria. I think the United States is one of the key creators of this organization. Quoting Graham Fuller, former CIA analyst, very prominent commentator in the region for many years. The United States did not plan the formation of ISIS, he says, but its destructive interventions in the Middle East and the war in Iraq were the basic causes of the birth of ISIS. And to this we may add that the world's greatest terrorist campaign, Obama's global assassination programs by drones and special forces, it also has a resentment-generating impact, which should be well known to require further comment. If you look back over it, it's a record to be contemplated with some awe. Also, the null reaction to it. It's a record that should inspire reflection and self-examination, certainly among people like us who are mostly the inheritors of the tradition, intellectual, moral tradition that has its roots right here in antebellum Concord, one of the most distinguished and appealing periods of American life, which did not survive the outbreak of the war. That was again shortly before the intellectual classes made their appearance in contemporary terms, even before the term intellectual was used in its modern sense. The history of intellectuals is, of course, written by intellectuals, so they therefore come out looking pretty good. The real history, which is not hidden, merits serious contemplation, and in particular, the lessons it should teach us for the immediate future. Thanks. Actually, it would be helpful to me if somebody could come up and repeat questions to me. I don't hear very well, so I might not hear them. If anyone would like to volunteer.
I heard Rand Paul said he was going to cut the military by 50%. Rand Paul is a Republican. Should I vote for a Republican?
I don't think there's any law against voting for Republicans. During the 1960s, the war in Vietnam, horrible atrocity, was basically a democratic war. And in this area, eastern Massachusetts, in Congress, the main opponents were Republicans. The people I personally had dealings with, setting up meetings in my house for a congressional representative and so on, were people like Brad Morse, Republican congressman from eastern Massachusetts. So you have to choose. Now, Rand Paul, it's a pretty mixed story. He's shifting his positions. Many of them, I think, are extremely destructive. On the domestic scene, what's called libertarianism in the United States, which is radically different from the libertarian tradition going back to classical liberalism, whether they know it or not, is actually advocacy of the most extreme form of tyranny that can be imagined, namely the tyranny of unaccountable private economic power. Can't imagine anything worse than that. And that's what's called libertarianism. On the other hand, it is also true, as you say, that Rand Paul has been a critic, as his father was, of U.S. intervention and is calling for cutting it back. Again, you can ask about the grounds, mainly pragmatic grounds. It's not good for us. But a lot is at stake, so one has to make complex judgments.
I've been a lifelong Republican, and it's my party, and I'll cry if I want to. But is there any of these wonderful slogans you've come up with over the years that can teach my party, Nelson Rockefeller Republicans, Teddy Roosevelt Republicans, Lincoln Republicans, to quit shooting themselves in the foot?
Well, actually, there used to be a quip in the United States back 60 years ago. I think it may come from C. Wright Mills, but it was pretty common, saying that the United States was a one-party state, and the business party with two factions, called Democrats and Republicans, which differ slightly. And that's no longer true. It's still a one-party state, the business party, but has only one faction. And they're not Democrats, they're moderate Republicans. The mainstream of the Democratic Party is now what would have been called moderate Republicans, Nelson Rockefeller Republicans, let's say 30, 40 years ago. Both parties have shifted far to the right. The Republicans have shifted so far to the right that they're totally off the political spectrum. That's not just my judgment. One of the leading conservative commentators, political analyst Norman Ornstein, describes the current Republican Party as a radical insurgency that has abandoned any commitment to the parliamentary process. They're way off on the right. They're not part of the parliamentary system anymore. They are so dedicated to private power, unaccountable private power, that they cannot garner votes except by organizing sectors of the population that have always been around, but were never really politically organized before. It's a very ultra-religious country, one of the most fundamentalist countries in the world, and fundamentalist Christians have become a major voting bloc. Nativists who want to make sure that they don't take over our white Anglo-Saxon heritage and take over our country. People who have to run around with guns because they're so terrified that somebody's going to come after them. This is pretty amazing when you look at it. You may have seen in the papers a couple of days ago, there's a number of women are trying to organize to oppose the extreme sexist violence and sadism in video games, which is apparently pretty horrifying. And they're subject to death threats, assaults, attacks. One of them was supposed to give a talk in Utah a couple of weeks ago. The talk had to be canceled because someone issued a threat to murder everyone in the audience. And under Utah law, the police cannot prevent someone from walking into an auditorium like this with their assault rifle. And that's what the country's become. That's the constituency of the radical insurgency that's now called the Republican Party, which is going to take over the Senate probably, as well as the House, the next November 4th. And bear in mind that the Republicans control the House primarily because of gerrymandering. In the last election, the Democrats won a considerable majority of House votes, but in our democratic system that doesn't work. So yes, there is one party, the centrist Democrats, basically moderate Republicans, and that's it. But go ahead.
One final comment I forgot to mention, I'm an Eisenhower Republican. But,
look, just remember Eisenhower. It's hard to believe.
I know.
But Eisenhower said anyone who ever questions any of the New Deal measures is not only off its rocker, but is out of the political system. Period. That was Republican in the 1950s. And now it's some kind of radical fanatic off on the left. Richard Nixon was actually the last liberal president. If you take a look at what Congress, what the so-called Republicans are doing now, they want to dismantle Nixon's measures, EPA, OSHA, things like that. That's Nixon. The country has shifted. What's happened in the country is pretty dramatic in the past generation. Yeah, go ahead.
one more comment.
Sorry?
I believe that my party is not that interested in democracy. They're interested in dominion.
In
Dominion.
Totally. The only policy of the Republican radical insurgency in the past years, surely inspired in large part by racism, it's hard to deny that, is to make sure that nothing works. That's it. Because if nothing works, then maybe those in office will be blamed for it, and maybe they can regain power and pursue the goals of the insurgency. But I think we should stop thinking in terms of Democrats and Republicans. There is really only one functioning faction of the business party, namely moderate Republicans called Democratic, New Democrats or something like that. And we should also be aware that to call the United States a democracy by now is pretty misleading. There's very good research. If you haven't looked at it, I really urge you to do it. One of the major topics in mainstream academic political science, and the work is quite good, is to compare attitudes with policies, which is pretty straightforward. The policies you see, the attitudes you can determine from a very extensive and often quite sophisticated polling, which yields consistent results over long periods and is done very seriously these days, not all, but many. And there is extensive study of this. The most kind of the gold standard in the field right now is a book by Martin Gillens called Affluence and Influence. This other work by Larry Bartels, Ben Page, and others. And the results are pretty striking. And what they show is that about 70% of the population, the lower 70% on the income scale, are literally disenfranchised. Their elected representatives pay absolutely no attention to their attitudes and beliefs. So they're disenfranchised. It's probably a major reason why they don't bother voting. They may not have read political science texts, but they know it from their lives. As you move up the scale, you start getting a little more influence. When you get to the very top, which probably means a fraction of 1%, they essentially determine the policies. That's not democracy, that's plutocracy.
Thank you for your comments on Angola, Cuba, as we say here, and Nicaragua. But the U.S., I know there's a lot of good and a lot of evil in the U.S. government and U.S. people, but both. But when I see that we always support, for the last 40 years, all the crazy dictators claiming the opposition is communist, and we support Saudi Arabia, the most undemocratic place in the world, as our best friend in the Middle East. And my question is, are we the good guys or are we the bad guys? And if you don't want to answer that, do you expect to have your income tax audited for the next 5 years meticulously for what you say tonight?
When you look around, if you look at power systems like states, there really aren't any good guys. States are not moral agents. People are, not states. People should be and can be. Unfortunately, you do have phenomena like the one I described, Concord in 1861, when you get this rapid transition, which is characteristic of the educated classes right through history. Shouldn't happen, but it does. Not everyone. There are the Hawthornes, Russells, Dens, others. So you can't look for good guys. What you have to do is take a look at the world. As for finding communists under every bed, there's a very interesting period of American history to look at. It's a very revealing period. It's kind of striking that it's not studied much, almost never. But if you want to test this hypothesis that we were defending ourselves against communists, there's a very obvious place to look. 1990, Soviet Union collapses. No more communist threat, okay? What happens? Well, a lot. And it's very interesting. Right away, remember, NATO was presented as a military alliance that was necessary to defend Europe or all of us from the Russian hordes. Okay? 1990, no more Russian hordes. What's the obvious conclusion if you believe the propaganda of the last half century? Well, NATO should disappear. What actually happened? NATO expanded immediately in quite interesting ways. The Russian Premier Mikhail Gorbachev, actually made an astonishing offer in 1990. He offered to allow Germany to be reunified and to join a hostile military alliance, NATO. Take a look at the history of the preceding half century. Germany alone had practically destroyed Russia several times, killing tens of millions of people. And he was offering to allow a reunified Germany, militarized, to join a hostile military alliance. There was a quid pro quo. The phrase was, not 1 inch to the east. That was referring to East Germany. NATO was not to expand to East Germany. As soon as the offer was made and agreed to by President Bush #1, NATO expanded to East Germany. Gorbachev was infuriated, and he was informed by Bush and his patrician Secretary of State James Baker that there was nothing on paper. It was a gentleman's agreement. And if he's dumb enough to accept a gentleman's agreement with the United States, it's his problem. Clinton came along and expanded NATO further. The mission of NATO changed officially. The official mission of NATO now is to protect the international energy system, sea lanes and pipelines. That means it's a global force, and of course an intervention force directed by the United States. Well, that tells us something about the defense against communists. There's more. In 1990, the Bush administration, this is Bush 1, immediately issued a new national security strategy, of course, once the Russians collapsed. What did it say? Basically, it said that everything's going to continue as before, but with new pretexts. Literally. It said we have to maintain a huge military system, it's approximately equal to the rest of the world combined, in order not to defend ourselves from the Russians. They're not around anymore. But because of, I'm quoting now, because of the technological sophistication of third world countries. Now, if you're a well-educated intellectual with a PhD from Harvard, you don't laugh. And if you look, nobody laughed. We've got to defend ourselves from the technological sophistication of the third world. So we need the military system. Second point was we have to maintain what they call the defense industrial base. Anyone who knows anything about American history, anyone who has an iPhone in their pocket or a laptop computer knows that funding via the Pentagon has been the basis for the IT revolution. That's the defense industrial base, the cutting edge of American state capitalism. Now we've got to maintain that. You can't expect private enterprise to take the risky and costly steps of decades-long development and research. That's to be paid for by the taxpayer. And interestingly, those who may have some fading belief that the United States is a capitalist country might recall that the primary principle of capitalism is that if you invest money, especially in a risky investment over decades, and finally some profit can be made, you're supposed to get the return. It's not the way it happens here. The taxpayer pours in money on the pretext that the Russians are coming. Out of it, after decades, comes a laptop computer, an iPad, and so on. But the profit doesn't go to the people who paid the money. It goes to those who market it, who redesign it and market it to Steve Jobs and Bill Gates and so on. That's what we call capitalism. So we have to maintain the defense industrial base. And the third element, which is in many ways the most interesting, was that the strategy said that we have to maintain intervention forces directed at the Middle East, where the threats to our interest, the serious threats to our interest, could not have been laid at the Kremlin's door. Could not have been laid at the Kremlin's door, I'm quoting. In other words, we've been lying to you for 50 years. The threats did not come from the Russians. The threat was what we call radical nationalism. That means independent nationalism. And that goes back to supporting Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia is considered one of the main barriers. It's the most radical fundamentalist state in the world. It's the funders and ideological center of groups like ISIS. But the United States has supported them, always, just like the British before us, when the British ran the place. Because radical fundamentalism is considered preferable to secular independent nationalism. But in 1990, it was conceded quietly that the threats have always been independent nationalism, not the Russians, like we told them. All of this went over with barely a comment. Take a look and research it. I mean, I wrote about it right away. A couple other people mentioned it. But without a comment, even though if you think for a minute, this is maybe the most revealing moment in order to determine what the real nature of American foreign policy is. That tells you something about the intellectual community too. But that's where Saudi Arabia fits in, apart from having the major resources of oil in the world.
Dr. Chomsky, question for you. You said we talked about iPhones and iPads. Where do you see social media playing a role in the next 5 to 10 years in this world, and how will it influence the way going forward?
So how, if you couldn't hear, how will social media influence all of these developments in the next 10 years? That's up to you. I mean, social media offer opportunities. If people use the opportunities, it can be very effective, or it can be a way of separating people from one another, directing them towards superficial, trivial, non-relationships, considered relationships. It depends how you use it. It's like any technology. It's useful, like a hammer.
Will it affect world events? Will it affect world events and the way we go forward on how communication between countries talk to each other?
Same question. If social media are used for education, organizing, building up real associations among people who get together and do things, if it's used for creating superficial pseudo-relationships, gossip, diversion from serious issues, and that would be the opposite.
I wonder if we don't turn the conversation to Israel and Palestine. My college roommate's daughter, Rachel Corey, was killed 11 years ago on the Gaza Strip, standing to protect the home of a pharmacist. She was bulldozed down by a Caterpillar machine. John Kerry has done a lot in trying to bring about a resolution to the Israeli-Palestine situation, yet we see Israel continuing to expand its housing into Palestinian areas. Should Hillary Clinton become president, what would you advise, or do you see any change in policy towards Israel by the U.S. government?
Rachel Corrie is a victim of our international terrorism delegated to others. Caterpillar is a U.S. corporation. It's acting to facilitate technically criminal actions. Technically criminal. Remember that all of Israel's actions in the occupied territories are illegal. That's been determined by the UN Security Council, World Court. It's recognized essentially by the entire world, with the exception of the United States, which continues to support Israeli crimes. It's the basis for the answer to if a new American president comes in, he's not going to ask me for advice. You know exactly what there is a possibility, for example, this is a question that should be raised to the audience. What do we do? Well, one possibility is to pressure the U.S. government to follow its own laws. The U.S. has laws. It's called the Ley Law, Patrick Ley, which bans export of military equipment to any military entity that's involved in serious human rights abuses. I mean, the Israeli army is involved in human rights abuses to the sky, which means all of our export of arms to Israel is illegal even by U.S. law, of course by international law. Now, that's why groups like Amnesty International for many years have been calling on an arms embargo. And one thing we can do, pretty simple, is suggest that the United States should follow its own laws. Simple step. The second is that it should stop providing the decisive support for criminal actions. If you read the New York Times, say, about Jerusalem today, you read the standard formula is the new Israeli settlements in Jerusalem are not recognized by the world. That's a little bit of an understatement. They are explicitly called criminal by the Security Council repeatedly, with the U.S. even voting with the majority. They're criminal activities. All the activities in the occupied territories are Jerusalem doubly so, because there are special condemnations going back to 1968. So the new president might be pressured to turn the United States into a law-abiding country instead of a rogue state that disregards international or domestic law. Those are things that could be done. Kerry was carrying out so-called negotiations, but it's obvious from the start that those are meaningless. I mean, you can't have negotiations carried out by a participant in the conflict, in fact, the leading participant in the conflict. If there were to be serious negotiations, they would be conducted by some neutral party with some degree of credibility in the world, and maybe Brazil or something like that. And what you would have, it's not just because my wife comes from Brazil, and there would be two participants. On one side would be the Palestinians, on the other side would be the United States and Israel. Those would be real negotiations. The negotiations carried out by a participant in the conflict don't mean anything. They're not going to get anywhere. And certainly not until the United States shifts its policy. No time to go through the record, but just briefly. There is an overwhelming international consensus, includes practically everyone, about an immediate settlement. Unsolvable problems, but at least the main step toward a settlement, the reduction of the violence and so on. The terms are very clear. Two-state settlement on the internationally recognized border I'm quoting now, with guarantees for the sovereignty and the right to exist in peace and security of each state within secure and recognized borders. That's the basic international consensus. Then you deal with side issues. I was quoting from a UN Security Council resolution that was brought forth in 1976, January 1976, by the three major Arab states, Egypt, Syria, and Jordan. Israel refused to attend the session. The United States vetoed the resolution. Did so again, the same resolution under Carter. And so it continues to the present. Well, that's not graven in stone. That can be changed, as U.S. policy has been compelled to change by popular activism many times in the past. And that's the only answer I can think of.
One last question.
Yes, so you began by saying that since basically the mid-19th century, the philosophy has been pragmatism. And that the philosophy has been pragmatism. That's been pretty much
the leading American
the leading
contribution to modern philosophy.
And I'm curious as to, is there another philosophy that you would suggest that would work better, in essence, for America?
Well, could you hear? No. Okay. I mentioned that the major kind of U.S.-based contribution to modern philosophy is pragmatism. And the question was, is there some other philosophy that would work better? But first of all, I don't think there's anything wrong with pragmatism. It has a lot of value. If any philosophical position can be distorted into some horrifying version, and pragmatism can mean what I quoted: forget any moral values, forget anything except whether it works. That's a vulgarization of pragmatism. It is a version of pragmatism, extremely vulgar version of pragmatism, which ought to be bitterly condemned. It's the prevailing kind. And it's not just the United States, and it's not because anybody read a philosophy book. That's the way states operate, and that's the way intellectual classes operate. The evidence on this is just overwhelming. Sometimes they may call it pragmatism, sometimes they may call it something else. But actual pragmatism, the point of view developed by Charles Sanders Peirce, William James, John Dewey in his Better Moments, and others, has many very positive elements, I think. And it's a point of view that should be taken quite seriously. But I don't think the problem is philosophical doctrines. The problem is very consistent patterns of behavior of systems of power, like states, like concentrated private capital, and very standard responses to this by the educated classes. What happened in Concord in 1861 is a very striking example of this kind of in microcosm. As I said, within days, Emerson had shifted from being a radical individualist opposed to big organizations, even welcoming the work which would break them down. Within days, he had shifted to become a raving chauvinist. That's happened over and over, not just here.
What about Thoreau?
What?
What about Henry David Thoreau?
Thoreau,
Who wouldn't pay his taxes
that was a different
for
war.
the war against Mexico.
That was
But,
1948. It's not the Civil War.
no, but this is before the Civil War.
Yes, this was the period of the antebellum Concord transcendentalist intellectual community.
But look what he started, civil disobedience. All these protests today in China, all over, these young people are doing Thoreau's civil disobedience.
And here too, Thoreau's civil disobedience was not insignificant, but remember, it was one night in a very pleasant jail. There's much more serious civil disobedience than that. Here too, pick say the Vietnam War. I mean, there were thousands of young Americans who voluntarily refused to serve in the Army, facing years of imprisonment or permanent exile, which is not a joke for an 18-year-old. That's way beyond anything that Thoreau contemplated. And it continues. Give you many examples. Yes, and it's a perfectly good way of responding to crimes. Thoreau, remember, was condemning a war which was described by President Ulysses S. Grant, General Grant, who fought in it, as the most wicked war in history. It was a war in which the United States, with no pretext whatsoever, invaded and conquered half of Mexico. That's why the cities from San Francisco, through Santa Fe have Spanish names. It's all occupied Mexico. And it was recognized right away, even by President Grant, as, in his words, the most wicked war in history. And there was plenty of protest against it, especially in New England, where New Englanders were not in support of the war. There was a slavery issue, remember. At issue was whether slavery should be expanded to this new area. That was a big issue. And Thoreau, to his credit, did oppose it and even didn't pay his taxes and spent a night in jail. That's good. But what happened, and again, there were also people who didn't join the consensus in 1861. Nathaniel Hawthorne's the most famous. Same in 1916. I mentioned half a dozen, most of them in jail. And if you go to the present, it's the same. There is a fringe of exceptions. And it's striking to notice that this goes back to the earliest recorded history, long before there was any new class of intellectuals. So go back to classical Greece. Who was it who drank the hemlock? It was the man who was corrupting the youth of Athens by asking embarrassing questions. Socrates. Take a look at the Bible at roughly the same period. I mean, there were people who, by our standards, it would have been called dissident intellectuals, people who were condemning the crimes of the evil kings, who were carrying out geostrategic analysis and charging them with leading Israel to disaster, who were calling for mercy for women and children and orphans and so on. They're called prophets. That's a bad translation of a very obscure Hebrew word. They weren't prophesizing. But they were what we would call dissident intellectuals. How are they treated? You've read the Bible. They were imprisoned and driven into exile. They're called haters of Israel. That's actually the origin of the notion of Jewish anti-Semitism. They were haters of Israel because they were condemning the acts of the evil king. But there were people who were honored at the time, the flatterers at the court. Centuries later, many centuries later, they were called false prophets, not at the time. And that pattern has replicated throughout history. A striking example is right here. That's why I focused on it today. It's a very significant moment, early Civil War years right here, for the ensuing history when a new class of a new social formation of intellectuals actually began to crystallize. And it's the pattern that has continued right to the present. Take a look at the reaction to the New York Times story that I commented on. It doesn't have to be like that. It can change, and it often does, by popular activism. That's why we live in a more civilized world than we did in the past.
Mr. Chomsky? No, thank you very much.